I want to thank Bill Voisey for arranging this meeting and La Costa Glen for hosting us. The topic is looking forward with NACRA. We want this to become a conversation. Hence, I plan to start with a rapid fire overview and then open it up to your questions. Start thinking now about questions, since that will be the most valuable part of the meeting. If we run out of time, we'll follow up later. But for now, I'll make a note of your questions and we'll come back to that later. I have a couple of questions to illustrate the trust relationship that you have with the provider organization. How many of you have read your contract? My experience is that most residents have not read their contract. My sister moved to a Ccrc not long ago, not the same one where I live, and she hired a lawyer to help her. Here's an excerpt from the contract my sister signed to move in. Quote, "I understand and agree that at any time and from time to time, all without notice to me and without affecting your rights or my obligations hereunder, you may alter any terms of the residence agreement or any part of it, including renewing, compromising, extending, accelerating, or otherwise changing the time for payment of amounts due thereunder." The provider would permit no changes. The attorney advised against signing such a contract, but my sister wanted to move in. She trusted the people she'd met at marketing, and so she accepted the agreement without modification. And I can affirm that so far, the provider has lived up to the trust that she placed in the provider, even though they had this one-sided agreement. How many of you have a Type A contract? How many know what a Type A contract is? Your responses indicate the high level of trust that you place in your provider organization. This is a trust business. I'm here to talk about a culture, a dream in which providers and residents work together as equals for the common purpose of ameliorating aging. The slides are my teleprompter for the talk. Some people learn best by listening, some by reading, some by both. Let's give it a go. Make a note of your questions. We'll have ample time to delve into them later. Now, let me start with my own story so you have a better idea of who I am. First, that's my wife, Valerie. And you've got me in front of you. You don't have Valerie, and this is really our story. It begins in 1998 when Valerie's parents moved to Rivermead, a Ccrc in Peterborough, New Hampshire. They were then in their late 80s. We liked what we saw: meals, a nice home, activities, and standby care if it was needed. In 2004, our friends, the Swansons, started looking for a Ccrc. We joined them in their search. They moved to Air Force Village West, but we were not eligible, and we joined the wait list for Carlsbad by the Sea. And in 2006, after 2 years on the wait list, we moved to the Carlsbad by the Sea retirement community right here in Carlsbad. We love the location. You can see a picture of the view. Our apartment is down there on the right. But we were naive and simply assumed that all was what it appeared to be, carefree and liberating. I should say that I, because I'm an actuary by training and have worked in the insurance industry, and I assumed that Ccrcs are regulated as are the insurance companies. After all, the elderly are more vulnerable than most policyholders. That's our story. What's the situation at La Costa Glen? First, I can affirm that the contracts are more consumer-friendly than at many California CCRCs. You've just seen the example of contract language. I don't think you'll find anything like that in your own contract, though it's worthwhile reading the contract. La Costa Glen pays its fair share of taxes. Many providers in this industry claim tax exemption and don't contribute to the towns in which they dwell. So that's an important factor. You can feel good that you're contributing to the municipal services that you need. The operations at La Costa Glen are run on business principles. This is more the case for the investor-owned CCRCs than it is in the nonprofit area, where they're always looking for a charitable purpose or acknowledging that things may not be performing as well as expected, but it's fulfilling some kind of nonprofit concept. The residents are given a care inclusive contract. That's the type A contract that I alluded to earlier. That's the gold standard for the industry, and fewer CCRCs are continuing to offer such a contract because of the escalating cost of care as people live longer and need more care toward the end of life. And there is no debt here other than the resident's trust claim on the property. If the provider were to fail financially, the La Costa Glen contracts provide that the ownership of the property, the buildings and the plant, is in the hands of the residents who have paid their entrance fees. The residents are thus protected by that trust claim. Let's look at CCRC pricing in California, since I was told that this has been an issue for you. Rates are generally market determined. There is no rate regulation for CCRCs in California, either initially or at renewal. Most continuing care contracts do not include re-rating limitations. There are no constraints requiring individual equity, uniformity of practice, nor an analytical process in rate development. This is a question that was posed to me by your leadership. What is the experience of other CCRCs regarding the annual increase in rent? The Connecticut Continuing Care Residents Association tracks rate increases in Connecticut. And I show you an example of what that looks like here. I don't have California data. As I recall, Ccrc used to accumulate this kind of information, but I haven't seen it for many years. In addition to what Connecticut does and what Ccrc might do, McKnight's, which is a trade journal, provides guidance for the coming year, usually in November. And here you see an example from November 2017, suggesting that CCRC monthly rate increases for 2018 will average 3.1%, and then it goes into some detail on that. Ziegler is an investment banking firm specializing in the senior housing industry, and it too provides nationwide increased data. Here are the data, and California's in a higher cost area. We all know that, and costs have been rising here more rapidly than elsewhere in the country. So an appropriate range for California is probably in this, well, roughly the 4% annual increase area. Before we go to the next question that you raised, here are some background principles. Residents want a financially strong CCRC. That means that they don't want the rates to be held down if that results in failure of the CCRC, as happened recently at Air Force Village West, which I mentioned earlier. The initial pricing is critical. There's a temptation to price very competitively initially in the hope of achieving a very rapid occupancy fill-up. That can be hazardous, however, because then subsequent rates have to have a higher increase, and there's a question of whether that really is an act of good faith with the residents. So the better practice is to have the initial and subsequent repricing all follow a consistent program. Management wants rates that are market competitive, so that's a major factor that holds down any temptation to become greedy or whatever. Unless they're market competitive, they're not going to be able to achieve occupancy, and occupancy is a critical metric determining profitability. Management has to cover its costs. I guess that's obvious. So this is the second question that was raised. Are you aware of any tactics used which were successful in containing the increase? The most effective way to contain increases is to control costs. That may seem obvious, but it's less easily done than one might think. You live here in very luxurious circumstances, at least they seem so to me, coming from a local CCRC and seeing the facilities here. And that's going to have with it a cost. So those amenities that attracted you into living come with a price, and you're fortunate in having been able to meet that price hurdle. Wage costs are a big driver, and here I'm showing how California minimum wage increases have varied politically, but have generally tended until recently to lag increases in the cost of living. But here you see how recently the increases have escalated upwards, and they're moving toward the $15 an hour minimum wage, which you hear often touted on television. Consider now that, say, let's look at the period here at far right of this graph from 2010 through today. If you were pricing in that range, it looked like wages were holding steady, and inflation might have been holding steady. So if you priced according to that, you might now have some catch-up. The better way is to continuously increase the rates by budgetable amounts that people can absorb within their normal living costs, so that you stay ahead of the curve and that the organization doesn't lapse into a minus situation. And I should add that we've been fortunate, those of us who have our retirement savings invested in the markets, that capital markets have done very well recently. So our assets have been climbing higher than most of the claims made on them. The second thought here is that investor-owned businesses, and I believe La Costa Glen is owned by a partnership, are generally more money and cost sensitive than our nonprofits. That awareness translates into better value for consumers. Nonprofits may be more tolerant of underperformance, And the result is that the costs that are associated with that get overlooked, and the residents have to cover those additional costs. So typically, there's a better value with investor-owned CCRCs. I can add that it's hard to quantify exactly what that is, but a study by MedPAC, the government agency for hospitals, suggested that the nonprofits had a cost base roughly 5% higher than the cost base for the for-profits. Senior housing has not proved to be a good investment. And we're going to look at Brookdale. Brookdale is the largest provider of senior housing in the country. Here's how Brookdale's stock has performed since 2015 compared with the S&P. The S&P is the orange line at the top, and Brookdale is the bluish line at the bottom. That's not an attractive investment proposition for anyone, and Brookdale is a bellwether for how industry results have performed generally. We should assert that because of the contract relationship with the owners, pricing and repricing is up to the owners. That requires valid cost prognostications. So if they make a mistake, they're going to have to try to make it up with increases later. So there's a high level of trust here in the competency of the owners. It requires a valid market evaluation. It requires prudence and business judgment so that you don't increase the rates too rapidly, but so that you're able to increase the rates to stay ahead of costs and you don't get behind requiring a makeup. That translates into the avoidance of shock increases. For example, if you have favorable experience for a while and you moderate increases accordingly, and then all of a sudden the costs leap upward, which happens with a tightening labor market, and right now we're in a tightening labor market, that can result in shock increases. You don't want shock increases because occupancy is critical. So the hope is that by having moderate, regular, recurring increases, you can stay ahead of the cost curve and give the residents something that is budgetable and works within their means. It requires business integrity and mutual trust and candor with fair dealing. Mutual trust and candor is the essence of good business. You all are familiar with the old adage that a man's handshake should be his bond. Well, today it's probably a woman's handshake should be her bond as well. But that involves mutual trust and candor as opposed to sharp dealing. Now let's take a look at the California Continuing Care Statutes. They're in the Health and Safety Code. So think about that for a minute. Health and Safety Code does not involve contracts or finances directly. It's mainly concerned with health and safety. Chapter 10, Division 2, and the statutes are very detailed and very complex. That's right. It takes 4 pages just to list the table of contents. Now, in fairness, a lot of these are provisions that were put into the law by Ccrc, and they're minimal protections that give residents rights. They're sometimes honored more in a perfunctory way than in a substantive way, but there are all sorts of provisions in the law, and the law is very complex, which puts a tremendous compliance burden on the providers. A better approach this is just my personal opinion, might be to have principles in the statute with details and regulations and circular practice letters. Circular letters are a government device that's a step down from promulgating a full regulation. And an example of a principle was that residents ought to be protected from loss in the event of the provider failure. That would be a principle that could be addressed in statute. That principle is not now addressed in the California statute. There are many rules, but little enforcement beyond care incident reports and citations. And here's an example of such a citation. This one is at La Costa Glen, and the date is December 18th. And it reports that they made a visit after an unusual incident with a resident death, and they met with Keith Kaysen as executive director, and the investigator interviewed staff, reviewed records, and provided guidance on reporting requirements to ensure clarity. No deficiency were cited during today's visit. An exit interview was conducted, and a copy of this report, along with licensee rights, was provided to Administrator Keith Kaysen. That's the level of enforcement that takes place under the Health and Safety Code. Now, Air Force Village West, which is now doing business as Alta Vida Village, has been in receivership for, well, it's been in trouble for a couple of years and in receivership more recently. Then what that means is that initially the board of directors tried to overcome cash deficiencies and meet all the requirements. And ultimately, the debt providers were able to petition the courts to appoint a receiver to replace the board of directors. So now there's a receiver, a woman named Bellanne Riley, who is operating and conducting an auction to try to sell the entire Ccrc to a new buyer, in the hope that the debt providers can thereby not be significantly damaged. Of course, since all money comes ultimately from the residents, that's going to impact the residents and their rating. I should add that the Continuing Care Contracts branch of the Department of Social Services has been involved with the Air Force Village West situation, but has not had much influence. They've shown an interest, but I guess they don't feel that they have any enforcement authority there, so the outcome is fully in the hands of the receiver. Also, the Continuing Care Contracts Division prefers to keep providers and residents separate, and that is one of the factors that's contributed, in my mind, to tensions between providers and residents in California. Finally, there's a provider fee fund, which could be used by the Department of Social Services to improve staffing, funding, and oversight of the Ccrc industry. The money is there, so it would not be a burden for the taxpayers. But the Department of Social Services has elected not to use that money, and it largely just sits fallow. What are the issues? First, there are few safeguards to ensure that entrance fees are used for the contract purposes for which you paid them. Second, providers do not need to consult with residents. Management is accountable only to the owners and to the Department of Social Services. Residents are no more than contracting customers unless the trust deed provisions are triggered. That means you may come to feel that you made a bad deal. Well, there's no safeguard in law for people who make a bad deal. A bad deal is a bad deal. The option, I guess, is to move out, but if you're unhappy. But most people love where they're living and they just want to have a little more influence in the governance. That is not part of the contracting model that you have here at La Costa Glen. So what are the issues? In short, management, ownership, and financial circumstances can change after residents decide to move in, but the residents are still bound by their lifetime commitment. Resolving the issues. NACRA believes that the dividing line between providers and residents should be dissolved in favor of commonality. NACRA is committed to working with providers to integrate resident expectations with management priorities. And that might mean working with providers to make the regulatory environment a more positive one, both for residents and for providers. Right now it's very complex, but it doesn't seem to address these very material matters like insolvency. NACRA favors a regulatory environment in which residents are shielded from loss, especially the loss of their entrance fees, just as bank depositors, insurance policyholders, pensioners, etc., are protected from loss. Well, let's move on to some good news. You have responsibly taken action to provide for your own contingencies of aging. That's a very positive and responsible action to take. You have discovered the joys of communal living and have made many new friends and have discovered new interests, perhaps even new passions. Moreover, the food is tasty and free of the burdens of preparation and cleanup. And the apartments are fine after you've gotten past the stress of downsizing. Why then do so few eligible people choose to move to a Ccrc, even with its new name, Life Plan Community? A provider friend of mine is age eligible to move to a Ccrc. I asked her why she wouldn't move. She said, "I don't want to live among all old people. I can't afford the entrance fee. The residents are retired, they're not productive, and they're not engaged. Simply, the residents aren't like me." So, now we can answer the question, why do only 5% of those eligible choose senior housing? And that's a high estimate. There are other estimates that suggest that maybe 1% of the eligible population over age 65 has chosen senior housing. First, it's age segregated. Not everyone wants to live in an age segregated community. It's expensive and it can seem indolent. The senior housing industry needs what NACRA advocates. That is, financial security for residents and empowerment of residents. These are things that we might agree on and get together and start implementing so that the industry could be more attractive to the coming generation of prospective residents. Well, that's my talk. With that, we can open it up to questions.